The night before he left, nothing dramatic happened. No storm outside. No argument. No final goodbye that people later talk about. The city slept the way it always did. Lights blinking lazily, roads breathing under the weight of familiar footsteps. Inside his small room, Ion sat on the edge of his bed, staring at a backpack that wasn't even full. That scared him more than if it had been heavy, because a heavy bag meant planning. And this journey had begun with honesty instead. He wasn't running away. He was responding to a quiet pain that had grown loud enough to be impossible to ignore. For years, Ion had lived a life that looked acceptable. Not happy, not tragic, just acceptable. He woke up at the same time every morning, scrolled through the same news, walked the same roads, greeted the same people with the same half-smiles. Days passed like copies of each other, and weeks collapsed into months without leaving a mark. At some point, he realized something terrifying. Nothing was wrong, yet everything felt empty. And emptiness is harder to explain than pain. Pain has a story. Emptiness just has silence. The first time the thought of leaving crossed his mind, he dismissed it. Not practical, he told himself. Not responsible. He had bills. Expectations. People who assumed he would always be where he had always been. But the thought returned. Not loudly. Persistently. It appeared when he watched buses leave the station without knowing who was on them. When he saw old travelers sitting quietly, their eyes full of places instead of regret. When he lay awake at night wondering how he had become someone who waited for weekends instead of living days. One evening, after a particularly long and meaningless day, he caught his reflection in a darkened shop window, and for the first time, he didn't recognize himself. Not because he had changed, but because he hadn't. That was the moment staying began to hurt more than leaving. So now he sat there, in the half-light of his room, listening to the hum of a ceiling fan that had heard all his doubts, holding a ticket he had bought without telling anyone. A one-way ticket. No return date. His phone buzzed. A message from a friend. Same place tomorrow? Ion stared at the screen for a long time. His fingers hovered, then slowly typed. Not tomorrow. I'm going away. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. For how long? Ion exhaled. I don't know. And for the first time in years. That answer didn't frighten him. The morning of departure dawn arrived quietly, as if respecting the weight of his decision. At the bus terminal, people moved with urgency, chasing schedules, arguing with vendors, dragging luggage filled with certainty. Ion stood still for a moment, absorbing it all. He noticed how everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going, and how rare that felt. His bus waited at the far end, old and scratched, like it had lived many lives already. The destination board showed a town few people talked about. Not famous, not glamorous, just elsewhere. As he stepped onto the bus, a strange mix of emotions hit him all at once. Fear, because he was dismantling the structure of his life. Relief, because he was finally listening to himself. Guilt, because leaving always feels like betrayal, even when it's necessary. Hope, small, fragile, but undeniable. He chose a window seat. The engine started. And just like that, the life he had memorized began to move away from him. Buildings slid past. Corners he had turned 1,000 times blurred into distance. Familiarity loosened its grip. Ion pressed his forehead gently against the glass. He expected sadness. Instead, what he felt was space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to become someone he hadn't met yet. As the city disappeared behind him, he realized something important. Leaving doesn't always mean you're lost. Sometimes it means you're finally willing to be found. The first lesson of the road stretched endlessly. A grey ribbon cutting through landscapes Ion had never bothered to imagine before. Fields replaced buildings. Silence replaced noise. And inside him, something long dormant began to stir. He watched strangers board and leave the bus, brief stories intersecting with his for only minutes. A woman carrying a cage with a sleeping bird. An old man humming a tune with no words. A child pressing his nose to the glass the way Ion had moments ago. None of them knew him. And somehow, that felt freeing. When you're anonymous, you don't have to perform. The bus stopped near a small roadside stall. The driver announced a short break. Ion stepped out, stretching his legs, breathing air that smelled like dust and tea. He ordered a cup. The stall owner handed it to him and asked casually, "Where are you headed?" Ion opened his mouth, then paused. For the first time in his life, the honest answer wasn't a place. "I'm figuring that out," he said. The man smiled, not mockingly but kindly. "Good," he replied. Most people wait too long to admit that. That single sentence stayed with Ion as the bus resumed its journey. The road wasn't just taking him somewhere new. It was stripping away the lies he had told himself to survive. The road did something unexpected to Ion. It slowed him down. Not physically. The bus kept moving forward, mile after mile. But internally. The constant urgency that had once lived inside his chest began to loosen, as if his thoughts finally realized they didn't have to race each other anymore. For years, his mind had been loud. Endless planning. Endless worrying. Endless replaying of conversations that no longer mattered. Now, with nothing demanding his attention, silence entered. And silence can be uncomfortable when you're not used to hearing yourself. At first, Ion tried to fill it. He scrolled on his phone, listened to music, watched downloaded videos. But none of it held him for long. The road outside the window was far more honest than any screen. Eventually, he put the phone away. And that's when the memories arrived. Not all at once, gently like waves. Moments he had ignored for years resurfaced. Times he chose safety over curiosity. Times he said, maybe later, and never returned. Dreams he had postponed so long they stopped asking for attention. He felt a tightness in his chest. It would have been easier to stay distracted. But travel doesn't let you hide forever. The road insists you meet yourself. The town that didn't ask questions by evening. The bus reached a small town. The kind that didn't care who you were or where you came from. A place where clocks moved slower and people didn't rush past each other. Ion got down with his bag and no plan. The sun was low, painting the buildings in warm orange light. He walked until he found a modest guest house with peeling paint and a flickering sign. Inside, an elderly woman sat behind the desk. Knitting. Room? She asked, not looking up. Yes, Ion replied. She slid a key across the counter. Hot water works when it wants to. That was it. No forms. No interrogation. No expectations. The room was small. A bed, a window, a chair that leaned slightly to one side. Ion placed his bag down and sat on the bed. For the first time since leaving, he was completely alone. And the realization hit him hard. Back home, he was rarely alone, but often lonely. Here, he was alone, but strangely at peace. He opened the window. The sounds of the town drifted in. Distant laughter. A radio playing an old song. Footsteps on stone. Life, unhurried and unconcerned. Ion lay back and stared at the ceiling. What am I doing? He whispered. The question didn't demand an answer. And that was okay. Night teaches different lessons that night. Sleep didn't come easily. Not because of fear, but because his mind was finally quiet enough to feel. He thought about the version of himself he had left behind. The one who believed rest had to be earned. The one who confused being busy with being valuable. Tears formed unexpectedly. Not dramatic sobs. Just slow, honest tears. He hadn't realized how tired he was. Travel, he learned, doesn't just move your body. It exposes the exhaustion you've been carrying silently. He sat up and reached for the notebook he had packed without knowing why. On the first page, he wrote, I left because staying was making me forget myself. The words surprised him. They felt true. He kept writing, not beautifully, not carefully, just honestly. Thoughts spilled out without structure or censorship. Regrets. Gratitude. Questions with no answers. By the time he closed the notebook, something inside him felt lighter. He slept deeply. Morning without a schedule the next morning, sunlight woke him. Not an alarm. Not urgency. Just light. Ion stepped outside and walked aimlessly through the town. He noticed things he would have missed before. The way shopkeepers greeted each other, the rhythm of daily life, the absence of rush. He bought breakfast from a street vendor and ate it standing, watching people pass. No one cared who he was. And somehow, that gave him permission to simply exist. As he wandered, he realized something important. Freedom isn't always about doing more. Sometimes it's about needing less. Less validation. Less certainty. Less control. For the first time in a long while, Ion wasn't measuring his life against anyone else's timeline. He was just here. The first step of inner strength later that day. Sitting near a quiet road leading out of town, Ion faced a realization that changed him. Motivation, he understood, is not a constant feeling. It's a decision. You don't wake up brave every day. You choose to act despite fear. Despite doubt. Despite not knowing. The journey ahead was uncertain. Money was limited. Answers were absent. Yet something inside him felt steady. Not loud confidence, but calm commitment. He stood up, adjusted his bag, and walked toward the road leading forward. No dramatic music. No promise of success. Just a step. And then another. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is continue, even when clarity hasn't arrived yet. The road out of the town was narrow, quiet, and almost shy, as if it didn't expect many people to choose it. Ion walked for a while before finding a ride. The kind of walking that isn't about reaching somewhere quickly, but about letting your thoughts stretch their legs. Each step felt deliberate. Each breath felt earned. A small truck eventually slowed beside him. The driver, a man with sun-worn skin and kind eyes, leaned out. "Where to?" he asked. Ion hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "Forward." The man chuckled. "That's where I'm going too. Get in." Conversations that change you. The truck rattled along the road, carrying sacks of grain, and two strangers who wouldn't remain strangers for long. The driver's name was Rogov. He spoke slowly, as if words were something to be respected rather than wasted. They talked about simple things at first, weather, roads, long drives. Then Rogov asked, "You look like someone who just started listening to himself." Ion blinked. "Is it that obvious?" Rogov nodded. People who know where they're going look tense. People who don't look lighter. That stayed with Ion. Rogov told him about years spent chasing money, status, approval, and how one quiet morning he realized he had built a life he didn't recognize. "So I chose roads instead," he said. "They don't lie to you." As the truck moved forward, Ion realized something profound. Every traveler carries two journeys, the visible one on maps, and the invisible one inside. And the invisible one is always harder. When doubt returns by afternoon, they parted ways at a crossroads. Rogov drove on. Ion stood alone again, watching dust settle where the truck had disappeared. The silence returned, and with it doubt. How long can I do this? What if I fail? What if I go back unchanged? These questions didn't scream. They whispered. And whispers are dangerous, because they sound reasonable. Ion sat on a rock by the roadside, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle on his shoulders. This was the part of travel people didn't post about. The in-between moments where courage wavers. He remembered something Rogov had said before leaving. The road doesn't give answers early. It checks how badly you want them. Ion closed his eyes. He didn't need certainty. He needed resilience. Choosing movement over fear as evening approached, Ion reached a stretch of open land where the sky seemed larger than usual. Clouds drifted slowly, unbothered by human timelines. He realized then that fear hadn't disappeared. It had just stopped controlling him. Fear doesn't mean stop. Fear means pay attention. He stood up again. Another step. Another choice. Not because he was sure, but because standing still felt heavier than moving forward. That realization hit him deeply. Sometimes growth begins when you stop waiting to feel ready. Night under an honest sky that night. Ion slept outdoors for the first time. No walls. No locks. Just a sky full of stars he hadn't noticed in years. Lying there, wrapped in a thin blanket, he felt small, but not insignificant. There was comfort in knowing the world was vast, and his struggles were not the center of it. He whispered to the darkness, "I'm trying." The sky did not answer, but it didn't need to. He fell asleep feeling something unfamiliar, yet welcome. Trust. Not in outcomes, not in plans, but in himself. The quiet shift by the time morning arrived, something inside Ion had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. He understood now that this journey wasn't about escape or achievement. It was about learning how to carry himself differently, with patience, with honesty, with courage that didn't require applause. He packed his bag slowly, and before stepping back onto the road, he wrote one more line in his notebook. "I may not know where I'm going, but I know who I'm becoming." The road stretched ahead, and for the first time, Ion smiled, not because he was happy, but because he was aligned. The road after that night felt different. Not because it changed, but because Ion had. He walked with less urgency now. His steps weren't searching for escape anymore. They were grounded, intentional. The kind of steps taken by someone who has stopped arguing with himself. By late morning, the road curved toward a cluster of hills. The air grew cooler, thinner, and every breath felt sharper, like it was clearing something inside his chest. That's when fatigue arrived. Not dramatic exhaustion, the quiet kind that creeps in when adrenaline fades. His legs ached. His shoulders protested the weight of his bag. Doubt returned, not as fear, but as logic. You could stop. You could turn back. No one would blame you. The most dangerous thoughts are the reasonable ones. Ion stopped near a small stream and sat down. He removed his shoes, letting cold water numb his feet. The relief was instant, and so was the temptation to stay. Rest can easily become avoidance if you're not careful. As he watched water move endlessly forward, he realized something uncomfortable. Motivation doesn't disappear because you're weak. It disappears because growth is demanding payment. And the payment is discomfort. The weight of old identities while resting. Ion thought about the version of himself people knew. The dependable one. The predictable one. The one who never surprised anyone, including himself. He wondered how many times he had said yes when he meant no. How many times he had chosen familiarity over truth. Travel wasn't just changing his surroundings. It was threatening his old identity. And that scared him more than loneliness ever had. Because if he wasn't that person anymore, who was he becoming? Ion stood up abruptly, shaken by the realization. This journey wasn't about places. It was about shedding skins that no longer fit. Meeting someone who stayed by afternoon, he reached a hillside village. Small houses clung to the slope, as if they had grown there naturally. Children played with things that weren't toys. Life felt unpolished and real. He stopped at a small tea stall. The owner, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and steady hands, served him without asking questions. Ion sat quietly, letting the warmth settle into his bones. After a while, the man spoke. "You look like someone who left something behind." Ion smiled faintly. "Or someone who finally picked something up." The man nodded slowly. "I used to think leaving was the only way to live." "What changed?" Ion asked. "I stayed," he replied simply. That sentence hit Ion harder than expected. The man explained he had once dreamed of travel, of freedom, of elsewhere. But circumstances, responsibilities, and fear had kept him rooted. "For a long time, I thought staying meant failing," he said. "Then I realized, staying is also a journey. Just a harder one for some people." Ion listened carefully. Not everyone who stays is stuck. Not everyone who leaves is brave. The road wasn't superior to home. It was just his medicine. A test of commitment that evening. Dark clouds rolled in without warning. Rain followed, heavy, relentless. The path ahead turned muddy. Visibility dropped, and the romantic image of travel dissolved into cold reality. Ion found temporary shelter under a tree, rain soaking through anyway. His clothes clung to him, heavy and uncomfortable. This was the moment, the one where people quit. Not loudly, quietly, convincing themselves it was practical. Ion stood there, rain dripping from his hair, teeth slightly chattering. And then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he understood. This was the cost, and he was willing to pay it. He stepped back onto the road. Cold, wet, determined. Because motivation isn't about feeling good. It's about moving anyway. Nightfall, and resolved by night, he reached a shelter used by travelers. Simple. Bare. Safe enough. As he changed into dry clothes, his body exhausted. His heart felt strangely strong. He wrote again in his notebook. The road doesn't promise comfort. It promises honesty. Lying down, listening to rain hit the roof, Ion realized something powerful. He was no longer waiting for permission. Not from society. Not from fear. Not even from himself. He had chosen. And choice, once made honestly, becomes strength. Morning arrived slowly, as if the world itself was tired from the storm. Ion woke before sunrise, the air still damp, the ground smelling of rain and earth. His body ached, the honest kind of ache that comes from effort, not regret. For a few moments, he stayed still. Not because he was tired, but because he was listening. Somewhere between sleep and waking, he realized something important had shifted during the night. He no longer felt the need to justify this journey. Not to friends, not to family, not even to the version of himself that used to demand explanations. The road had done what years of thinking could not. It had silenced the inner courtroom. Walking without an audience, as Ion stepped back onto the road, he noticed how differently he carried himself. His pace was steady, his breath calm. There was no urgency to reach somewhere impressive. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to prove anything. Not success, not bravery, not uniqueness, just presence. He realized how much energy he had wasted living for invisible audiences. Imagined judgments, comparisons, expectations that no one had formally placed on him. Yet he obeyed anyway. The road didn't care. It didn't clap. It didn't criticize. It simply existed. And in that indifference, Ion found freedom. The weight he didn't know he was carrying by mid-morning, the road curved into a forested stretch. Sunlight filtered through leaves, breaking into soft patterns on the ground. He stopped for water and suddenly felt it, a tightness in his chest. Not pain. Release. His eyes filled before he could stop them. He hadn't realized how heavy his inner life had been. How much pressure he carried to be enough, in ways that were never clearly defined. He sat down on a fallen log and let the emotion pass through him instead of resisting it. That was another lesson the road was teaching him. Strength isn't about control. It's about allowing what's already there. When the wave passed, he felt clearer, lighter, not healed, but honest. A lesson from someone who had nothing to teach later that day. Ion met a boy walking barefoot along the roadside, carrying a bundle of firewood larger than himself. They walked together in silence for a while. Finally, Ion asked, "Doesn't it get tiring?" The boy shrugged. "Only when I think about it." That simple answer stayed with him long after they parted ways. So much suffering, Ion realized, came not from what we do, but from how much we resist doing it. The boy wasn't inspirational. He was real. And reality, when accepted, becomes lighter. Motivation reframed as evening approached. Ion reflected on motivation. How misunderstood it was. He used to think motivation came before action. That you waited until you felt ready. The road had taught him the opposite. Action creates motivation. Movement generates clarity. Commitment precedes confidence. You don't walk because you're strong. You become strong because you walk. That realization rooted itself deep inside him. Not as a quote, but as lived truth. The quiet victory that night. Ion stayed in a small shelter shared by travelers. No deep conversations. No dramatic moments. Just rest. As he lay down, he felt something unfamiliar but powerful. Contentment without achievement. He hadn't reached a destination. He hadn't accomplished anything measurable. Yet he felt successful. Because he had stayed true to the hardest thing of all, his inner voice. Before sleeping, he wrote one final line for the day. "I am no longer trying to become someone. I am allowing myself to be." The road narrowed again, as if asking Ion a question it wouldn't let him ignore. By now, his body had adjusted to the rhythm of walking. The ache was still there, but it had become familiar, almost reassuring. Pain that had meaning no longer frightened him. What frightened him was what surfaced next. Memories he had successfully buried for years began to rise, not aggressively, but patiently. They waited until he was strong enough to look at them without flinching. This was the part of the journey no one warned you about. When silence becomes deep enough, truth finds its voice. The thing he never said out loud. Ion stopped walking without realizing it. He was standing alone on an empty stretch of road, hills rolling quietly in the distance. The sky was wide, forgiving. The world felt still, like it was holding space for him. And suddenly, the truth arrived fully formed. He hadn't left because he was adventurous. He had left because he was tired of pretending he was okay. That realization broke something open inside him. He had spent years telling himself he was lucky. That others had it worse. That his dissatisfaction was ungrateful, immature, selfish. So he swallowed it. Day after day. Year after year. Until numbness replaced joy. And numbness, he now understood, is not peace. It is unexpressed pain learning how to hide. Grief for the life he never lived. Ion sat down on the roadside, pulling his knees to his chest. He felt grief, not for a person, but for a version of himself that never got to exist. The one who wanted to create. The one who wanted to explore. The one who wanted more than acceptable. He grieved the conversations he never had. The risks he never took, the courage he postponed until later. Tears came freely now. Not heavy. Not desperate. Honest. And in that honesty, something softened. He whispered, "I'm sorry." Not to anyone else. To himself. The most motivating truth after a long while. Ion stood up. He felt exposed, but also powerful. Because naming the pain had done something extraordinary. It had removed its control. Pain unnamed feels endless. Pain acknowledged becomes navigable. This was the most motivating truth he had learned so far. You don't move forward by ignoring what hurts. You move forward by walking with it. And suddenly, the road didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like reconciliation. Redefining strength as he walked on, Ion understood something about strength that changed him permanently. Strength is not endurance without feeling. Strength is allowing yourself to feel, and continuing anyway. He no longer wanted to be admired. He wanted to be aligned. That desire felt quieter than ambition, but far more durable. Nightfall and acceptance that evening, he reached a resting point overlooking a valley. Lights flickered in the distance like small promises. Wind brushed against his face, cool and grounding. Ion stood there for a long time. Not thinking. Not planning. Just being. For the first time in his life, he wasn't rushing to become better. He was allowing himself to become real. Before sleeping, he wrote, "I didn't leave to find happiness. I left to find honesty. Happiness can come later." The next morning, Ion woke with the sky still pink and quiet. Birds called from trees he couldn't name. And the wind carried the smell of earth and rain. Everything felt alive, yet nothing demanded his attention. For the first time, he was entirely present. He packed slowly, folding his notebook and placing it carefully in his bag. It had become more than a notebook. It was a mirror, a map of internal landscapes he hadn't dared to visit before. As he stepped onto the road, Ion realized, the journey ahead wasn't just measured in miles. It was measured in choices, in breaths taken deliberately, in moments of courage small enough to be ignored, yet monumental to him. Choosing yourself first at a roadside stream. He paused to drink water. He looked at his reflection in the moving surface and smiled faintly. The face staring back wasn't new, but it was newly honest. For years, he had prioritized other expectations over his own needs. The road had taught him that this was not kindness. It was quiet neglect, and he no longer wanted to practice it. He whispered to himself, "I am allowed to choose my life. I am allowed to choose myself first." It wasn't arrogance. It was freedom. The beauty of ordinary lessons. Ion walked for hours, noticing everything he had once ignored. The texture of stone walls warmed by sun leaves falling silently onto paths. Untouched by thought, the distant laughter of children that felt like music, not noise. Every ordinary thing became a teacher. Travel, he realized, isn't always about the grand or exotic. It's about seeing the extraordinary in what is simple. It's about learning to exist fully in the moments others overlook. Understanding fear and courage. By noon, a steep hill demanded effort. His legs burned, sweat ran down his temples, and the path seemed endless. Old fears whispered, "You're not strong enough. Turn back. This will only hurt." Ion stopped for a breath, closed his eyes, and listened. The fear was there, and that was fine. He did not fight it. He did not ignore it. Instead, he stepped forward. One foot, then another. Slowly, steadily, relentlessly. And with each step, he understood the core truth of motivation. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is moving forward despite it. Night on the hill. As night fell, Ion reached a small plateau overlooking the valley below. The world stretched endlessly in every direction. Lights flickered, rivers glistened, and the stars themselves seemed closer than ever. He sat there, knees drawn to his chest, and felt a quiet victory. Not loud, not triumphant in the traditional sense. Just real. He realized he had already won, though he hadn't crossed any finish line. Because he had begun the journey he had been avoiding for years. Because he had faced himself honestly. Because he had chosen movement over comfort, truth over illusion, courage over safety. Writing the lesson before sleeping, Ion wrote in his notebook once more. The road doesn't reward speed, popularity, or recognition. It rewards honesty. It rewards persistence. It rewards the willingness to keep moving even when no one else is watching. He closed the notebook, laid back on the cool ground, and let sleep take him without fear, without expectation, without judgment. The journey had begun, fully, authentically, and for the first time, without compromise.